right, guys. It is my pleasure to announce the next speaker. He's a legend. Although when I said I had an amazing speaker, he started looking around, see who that was. But he's very humble. He has a book that, if you want to get into penetration testing, this is just a must read. And we're lucky to have him here. And so, Phil, thank you so much for joining us today. And please take it away. Thank you.
Thanks for the warm welcome, Marco. So thanks everyone for joining. I hope you're enjoying the event. It's been a lot of fun, and it's pretty awesome that GitHub lets events like this happen. And thanks to all the sponsors. So the title of this talk is Offensive Security Awareness. So this came from my experience at a company where I was a red team lead. And when I worked at the company, you know, when you work in a certain area, you kind of you take for granted what you know, and you think other people in security know this as well. So more specifically, what I was talking about is in an organization, people in the cybersecurity teams didn't know the difference between a vulnerability scan, a vulnerability assessment, a pen test, or a red team operation with a true adversary emulation. They didn't know the difference between that. And it's kind of funny, I didn't really realize until probably recent year or so that I think the CISO of the company, they wanted to build a red team, and I don't think they really realized what a red team was, because we were doing more network pen testing. And so it just kind of got me thinking this is a good area for education. And I created a single slide for the organization that showed the different type of assessments, different types of offensive security engagements, and kind of compared them side by side to make an easy reference. And so last year I was asked to speak at Black Hat Middle East and Africa, and I wrote this presentation for there, and I've given it several times, a couple times before and several times after that. So a little bit about myself. I'm customer success lead and evangelist at Horizon3.ai. So I do a lot of conference speaking on offensive security. I've worked as a pen tester for over 12 years, in cybersecurity for over 20 years. And I'm a former adjunct instructor. I used to teach pen testing and web app pen testing at Dallas College. So this was kind of the inspiration for the book, The Pen Tester Blueprint. It started out as a lecture that I gave my students each semester about how to become a pen tester. And so I started teaching in January 2018. So by November of 2018, I gave it as a conference talk for the first time at B-Sides DFW, the Dallas-Fort Worth B-Sides conference. And so I was featured in the Tribe of Hackers Red Team book, and Wylie Publishing asked me if I had any ideas for a book. And so I decided to turn this into a book. So I'm also a podcaster, and I host the Philip Wylie Show, previously the Hacker Factory podcast. So on my podcast, there's a lot of interesting stories about how people got started in cybersecurity. And one of the things is, if you're trying to get into cybersecurity, know someone, those are very motivational to hear those stories, because people hear those stories and it kind of proves to them, okay, this person came from a similar background and I can do that. I always get people 30, 40, 50 years old saying, I'm too old to get into cybersecurity, and that's not the case. I've known people that have gotten in at 50 years old. But the good thing about the podcast, it just kind of encourages people, shows people from the different backgrounds, and proves that someone else can do it. And that's, if you look at sports, certain records stay in place, and once someone breaks that record, then everyone is exceeding that record or hitting that same number, and it's just a matter of proving it can be done. And so when people share their stories, it kind of serves that purpose. So we're going to discuss offensive cybersecurity, security assessment types, methodologies and standards, as well as security assessment tools. So defining offensive security. So offensive security involves using different TTPs or hacker techniques to assess the security of a target. Because all the time people are worried about the hackers getting into their network, them being breached by hackers. So no better way to defend your systems by assessing the security using those types of tools and techniques to see if they're vulnerable. An interesting thing too about offensive security pen test is vulnerabilities that you find they're exploitable are at a higher priority for remediation. Because sometimes you run vulnerability scans and may find false positives, but if it's actually exploitable, then it's a higher priority for remediation. Sometimes companies don't have the budget. Sometimes it could require hiring new staff, getting new tools, new hardware to remediate those items. So if you're able to prove they're exploitable, it's a lot easier way to get budget for remediation. And it's kind of interesting. I had this time when we were testing this large global law firm. So we're in there doing the pen test of their organization, and the chief security officer, when we got there were some vulnerable systems that he wanted us to check out because he had been trying to get the law firm for years to remediate it. They weren't they weren't approving the budget. So he actually showed us these systems, hoping it would find a way on a pen test report, because sometimes, unfortunately, companies won't listen to their internal employees, but if it comes from a consultant, then they're more likely to listen to it. And so this guy had to go as far as pointing out these weaknesses so we could hack into them and put them on the pen test report to finally get it fixed. So there's different type of targets, and this is just broad overview. Any kind of technology, things we have listed on here are common now, but new technologies that will come out that are just starting to be developed, they're not even thought of yet, will eventually come along and they'll need to be tested. Some of the main targets you're going to see is computers in the form of workstations and servers, networks, applications, cloud, hardware, transportation. So vehicles need to be tested. You see these autonomous vehicles that are driving around, you can see them here in San Francisco, driving around by themselves. These can be used and weaponized by someone. And when people are creating technology, these innovators, sometimes security is not their background, and sometimes they don't really think that attackers could leverage these technologies to harm people. A prime example is like hardware for healthcare, pacemakers and insulin pumps. Those could be exploited to hurt someone. And so at least technology is starting to take a turn, and they're starting to think about these things up front, because one of the examples too with the medical hardware, actually FDA is requiring pen tests now, which is a good thing. And so anyway, these are all the different types of pen tests you'll see, even hardware, physical security, and social engineering. Sometimes you may have the most secure environment, but if your physical security is not up to par, someone could slip into a server room, gain access to the systems, and they really don't have to be all that great of a hacker. So you really have to make sure, even if your digital footprint is really secure, you need to make sure that the physical is secure as well as people, through social engineering. Because if you send someone an email, they click on malware, then whatever level access that person that clicked on it, that's the level access the attackers got. So we need to make sure that we're testing those targets. And so different assessment types. And so this is not only offensive security, because vulnerability management and vulnerability assessments, you're not doing any exploitation, so it's really not into the offensive security realm yet. Then you have penetration testing, or the full long form is pen testing, penetration testing, and then red teaming, also known as adversary emulation. And we'll get into the difference between these. We're going to show the different types and the differences between those and kind of the importance of those different types of assessments. So vulnerability management is the cyclical practice of identifying, classifying, prioritizing, remediating, and mitigating systems and software vulnerabilities. Vulnerability management is integral to computer security, network security, and it's pretty much any other type of digital security. It must not be confused with a vulnerability assessment. So this definition was taken from Wikipedia. It was one of the better definitions that I saw out there. So vulnerability management, these are kind of the steps that are being performed in vulnerability management. And sometimes people don't think about the asset discovery. So if you don't have a good asset list of the digital assets in your environment, you're going to miss out on things. So you can't test things or secure things you don't know about. And nowadays with, marketing teams spinning up microservices for different campaigns, marketing campaigns, sometimes these don't get taken offline. Cloud infrastructure is so easy to spin up now. Back in my sysadmin days in the late 90s, you had like shadow IT internally, people build servers, but that would usually require bringing in consultants, a little more highly skilled. Now things are just pretty much push button and easy to spin these things up. So we really need to keep a good inventory of those things. Another example of where not decommissioning things can be a problem is I had a friend that was doing a pen test for a university. They had like a computer design and not computer design, but web design and web development course. and all the students got their own web server or their own instance of a web instance for a web page. And they kept building these and not decommissioning them. So this is like probably 10 years that these haven't been decommissioned. So you got to think of all the vulnerabilities that are out there that didn't get remediated. This stuff stayed in place. And while this may not be an actual website for the college, if someone's able to get in one of those vulnerable websites, and they can pivot to the inside. So be able to keep up with your inventory is very important, to make sure you're thoroughly testing things. This is why you've seen some of the external attack surface management products getting more popular, a way to manage that threat landscape. So after you do your discovery and have a good asset inventory, then you're going to do your vulnerability scanning. And so the vulnerability remediation, including patching, is part of this process. And so you want to repeat this. You just do it once a year, you're missing out on too much. So the frequency is very important to any type of assessment. And things like vulnerability management, doing the vulnerability scanning, has been traditionally one of the areas that you could do more frequently and easier. So vulnerability scanning, a vulnerability scanner is a software that is designed to assess the security of computers, networks, and applications for known weaknesses. So vulnerability scanning automates the process of detecting vulnerabilities by using the vulnerability scanner, which helps scale the amount of testing that can be done. So when pen testing kind of started out, you didn't have vulnerability scanners. Everything was done manually. You didn't have different exploit tools like Metasploit to do these things. So one of the things about offensive security and vulnerability management tools have evolved to make this a lot easier. And so vulnerability scanning was one way to really take things, help scale that. Because the thing is, some people that are purists when it comes to hacking thinks vulnerability scanners are cheating, but they're really a necessary evil, because otherwise it's going to take you too long to try to do all this manually. You're not going to be able to address the volume of testing that you need to get done. So vulnerability assessment. So vulnerability assessment is similar to vulnerability scanning, but you're taking it a step further. So with a vulnerability scan, you're just basically looking for vulnerabilities. Vulnerability scanners are notorious for finding false positives. And then there's also some cases that maybe it is vulnerable, but there's some mitigating control. A firewall, you see some of these vulnerabilities to be able to exploit. A lot of things have to be misconfigured for that to get pulled off. So when you're doing these vulnerability scans, when you're just doing the scan, you don't really know whether it's a false positive. And also you have to worry about false negatives. And with a vulnerability assessment, you're validating the vulnerabilities that you found. And you're also you can use other vulnerability scanners to detect items that maybe were not detected, and using different manual techniques and hacking tools to try to find those vulnerabilities. And by doing those manual techniques and using other vulnerability scanners, that kind of helps reduce the chance of the false negatives. So you basically get all this information together, you're validating it, so you've got a little better information than what you've seen with the vulnerability management, just the vulnerability scan. And so one of the things you see a lot of times with jobs or roles are VAPT, which is vulnerability assessment and penetration testing. And there's times that you would pick a vulnerability assessment over a penetration test. One of the examples of where I kind of had to change what I was doing, or kind of pivot from doing a pen test to a vulnerability assessment, I was doing a Wi-Fi pen test for this hospital chain. And I was on their network doing the vulnerability scans, just doing discoveries. And I noticed some medical devices, like in the emergency room and the operating room, connected to the Wi-Fi network. So this was kind of scary, because I thought if you get on there and you try to test one of these devices, someone could get injured, or even killed. So we went back, I talked to the CISO, and we kind of changed our plan up. So what we did is a vulnerability assessment. So doing everything except trying to hack the system, being very careful with the tools we use, not to knock any of these systems offline, and then did a configuration review of the Wi-Fi controllers to make sure that they were secure. So it's a way to give a good level of assessing the environment without causing the risk. Sometimes you have OT environments that you have to be careful, just different fragile systems. So sometimes you want to avoid pen test, and vulnerability assessments could be the way to go. And so penetration tests. So similar to vulnerability assessment, it's used to assess the security of your targets. So vulnerabilities are validated in pen test, just like a vulnerability assessment. But what we're doing now is you find all these, you're doing your testing, your manual testing, as well as the automated scans. And then you're going to go through and see if those can be exploitable. And so these are the ones that are higher risk to actually remediate. And so once you go through and you're able to exploit those, then you're trying to see if you can do any kind of privilege escalation, elevating your privileges, or any kind of data exfiltration. And so the different pen testing types, you have the first one, which is more like the attacker view, more like the threat actor. Black box, also known as a blind pen test. This is more like what the threat actors are doing. And any type of pen test you're doing, it's a good idea to start off this way to actually see if you can get a foothold to get into the system. And then you have gray box, which is detailed information like the IP addresses, domain names. So you have a good target of the systems that you're going to assess. And then you have white box, also known as crystal box or assumed breach. So this is more detailed information. If it's an application, you've got source code and credentials to be able to log into a system. For applications, you want to get all different levels of access to see if you can elevate privileges, get access to data or functions that you shouldn't. And so all these, the main difference you're going to see here is the amount of reconnaissance you're going to have to do to uncover it. So with the black box, the more you're going to have to uncover to be able to perform the pen tests. So I've done tests before where companies gave us the physical address that we were testing physical security, but it was up to us to find all the network blocks and stuff from reconnaissance. And this is helpful too, because you're able to see what can threat actors uncover. Not only can someone get in from a threat actor perspective, but what kind of information are they able to uncover? And so gray box is more what you're going to see on your network pen test. It's going to be a list of IP addresses. And the good thing about this compared to the black box or blind pen test is everything's going to get tested because you have that scope. If you go through the first method, there could be some systems that get missed. And it's really a good idea to do a combination of these. And with the white box, crystal box, or assumed breach, this was mainly around applications, but it's become popular now for network pen tests. And this is needed too, because the systems and just kind of what I've seen in 12 years as a pen tester, used to you went in an environment, you were going to get access pretty easily. And now it's getting more difficult because these endpoint detection systems are getting better at preventing attacks. But the thing about that is too, is maybe these endpoint protections may prevent someone from getting initial access, hacking in. But what happens if they have credentials? What if it's a disgruntled employee, an insider threat? Sometimes employees will sell their credentials on the dark web, they're disgruntled. Or maybe they're part of a data breach. So a lot of the main ways to get foothold from external pen tests nowadays is from these password dumps from these breaches. And so that's a way pen testers will do that, try to get a foothold. So you just need to really test what happens if someone has that access internally, because just doing the black box approach is not thorough enough. So the assumed breach method is a way to more thoroughly test those systems. And so red teaming, this one kind of gets confused a lot. So red teaming is the process of using TTPs to emulate real world threat actors with the goal of training, measuring effectiveness of the people, process, technology, and defend the environment, also known as adversary emulation. So the founder of Dallas Hackers Association has one of the best, most simplistic definitions for red teaming is red teaming tests the blue team. So when you're doing a pen test, you're really not testing the defenders. And a lot of misconceptions you see sometimes too is people think is at a pen test, you're trying to go undetected. But pen tests are also referred to as a time box test. So you've got limited time. So you really don't have time to try to go undetected. I've done engagements earlier in my career where we go in, try to see how long we could go undetected. But with these type of assessments, red teaming, you typically have a longer time. And they have a control group. So not everyone knows. On a pen test, you alert everyone. So that way, if there's something crazy going on with an application or there's some sort of outage, they know there's a pen test going on, so you can stop and investigate before you go further. With this type of test, you've got a control group. The CISO is usually in that group, maybe some other people in IT, but they don't always tell the blue team this is going on because you're testing the reactions. And so if they know what's going on, it's really hard to get a true assessment of how the defenders are doing. So there'll be like a limited number of people that run the test. And one of the interesting things that I saw a good kind of the reaction you want to get from these type of tests. This company had an incident response firm on retainer. So if they had any incidents, they could bring them in, didn't have to go through signing a statement of work and doing all this stuff, going through the purchasing process. This is already there. In case you needed IR, you need to be able to take care of things right away. So this red team operation was going on, and the blue team saw something kind of fishy. So they brought in the IR team to investigate, and they had told the CISO what was going on. The IR team was already investigating. And so the CISO told them, yeah, this was a planned engagement. So this is exactly what you want to do. In some cases, you're in all cases, you're testing the technology, but also the people in the process. And even like your incident response plan, you're testing that plan too as well. And the interesting thing is too, is there's strengths to pen testing and red teaming. So with a pen test is kind of the priority because you want to do that more frequently, finding exploitable vulnerabilities and remediate those. With a red team operation, this is something you don't do as frequently, but something you do as your organization matures more. Because you take someone in to do a red team operation in a company that really hasn't been having pen tests done, and they're going to go through real easily and get in that environment. So you want to kind of wait as your organization matures. And these are kind of longer running processes, so a pen test, like from a consulting perspective, typical pen test would be 40 hours. With the red team operation, this could be weeks, months, or even a year. Because if you look at the adversaries, they're trying to break in these environments. They work on this for a while, and so they're trying to go undetected. So this is part of the reason it takes longer to get in. And also when you're trying to emulate a threat actor, the same type of methods that you're doing there. So here's that comparison slide, pretty much like the one I created for the company I worked at. So you can see the different assessment types, and you can see the asset discovery and inventory on vulnerability management. And this kind of relates to reconnaissance on vulnerability assessments, pen tests, and then red team emulations. So with the red teaming, you're having to be really quiet with your reconnaissance. You just can't throw Nessus on there, do a Nessus scan, or you're not doing port and service scans because you'll be detected. And so also with all these, you have some kind of vulnerability detection. With the red team, you're doing more manual techniques, but with vulnerability management, vulnerability assessments and pen testing, you're using vulnerability scanners. And so then when you get to the vulnerability assessment and pen test, you're doing the validation of those vulnerabilities to see if they're exploitable. First of all, you're seeing if they're vulnerable to begin with before you test to see if they're exploitable, and then you try to exploit those and do post-exploitation. And so interesting when you hear about maintaining persistence, it's the red teaming where it's more important to maintain persistence because you're trying to go undetected and be quiet in your testing. So once you gain that access, you try to maintain that access in that environment without causing too much noise on the network. And sometimes you may find a backup way of doing things. This is where C2s are important, because going through and using C2s before on assessments and then in learning activities, one of the things that's interesting, like Cobalt Strike, is if you have a connection there, you have to reboot your system for some reason, you lose that connection, it's usually easier to reconnect using command and control. Otherwise, you got to go back and exploit the system all over again. And when you're running a tool like Metasploit Framework, sometimes you exploit that system, it may require rebooting before you're able to exploit it again. And especially when you're getting into something like a red team exercise, that's really not an option because you're trying to go undetected. So pen testing methodologies, one of my favorites is the PTES, the Penetration Testing Execution Standard. And one of the reasons it's my favorite is because it was created by some of the industry legends that like Dave Kennedy from Trusted Sec, Carlos Perez from Trusted Sec, Chris Nickerson from Lairs Consulting, they're a boutique pen testing firm, Joel McRae and several other folks. And so sometimes when you have just researchers or academic types trying to figure out how to do things, especially when it comes to pen testing, it's not based on industry experience. And so that's one of the reasons I like this particular methodology. That, and it's one of the most updated, most frequently updated, which was 2014, but still pretty relevant. A lot of the things haven't really changed much, except some of the technologies. And in this resource, they also showed some different tools that you can use for those different types of assessments. And the main sections of the penetration testing execution standard is the pre-engagement interactions. So this is goal setting, the meetings to set the goal, set the statement, to set the rules of engagement. So the rules of engagement, you'll define the times it's okay to test, because sometimes companies want to test after hours to prevent any kind of outages in production times. And also as well as the type of testing. So you may have things off limits, like most companies don't want any kind of denial of service testing done. And it's kind of interesting because there are modules in Metasploit. And one of the mistakes I made on my very first pen tests, actually back to that same law firm, I found this vulnerability or this exploit in Metasploit and didn't notice the DOS designation label on that exploit. And I executed against a server and ended up rebooting the server. So you have to be careful of those things. So intelligence gathering, this is where you're doing your reconnaissance. Then your threat modeling. Threat modeling is a little more important when you're testing really specialized systems, or you take like machine learning or ATMs. These are not normal things that you're going to be pen testing, whereas like applications, networks, you're going to know what the threat vectors are like, so you don't really have to get into the threat modeling. But more complex the system, you want to go in and define that. And so some of the things that affect systems, you take a ATM machine in a big city like San Francisco. If you have an ATM machine accessible 24 hours a day, there's going to be physical threats, but not as much as a ATM, say at a gas station or rural area that's not 24/7 and security's not coming around. In an instance like that, someone can actually steal the ATM, or it's a lot easier to break into the ATM. But in a city setting, it's a little more difficult. So you tailor it towards those type of attacks, and that's what you test for. And that's also the type of threat actors that you have attacking those systems to see the type of attacks they're using. So this is something where you can leverage cyber threat intelligence or the MITRE ATT&CK framework to see the type of attacks that are being done, and you can use those to simulate against those during those tests. Vulnerability analysis, after you've collected all this data, seen if it's exploitable, then you go on and try to exploit it, and then post-exploitation in the report writing phase. So post-exploitation techniques or lateral movement, the process by which attackers spread from one entry point to the rest of the networks. Privilege escalation, the process of gaining elevated permissions on a system or application, and then accessing data. This is one of the things people don't think about sometimes. Sometimes it doesn't require domain admin, or root level access to gain this sensitive data. So you want to test that too as well. That way you're making sure that there's proper controls on your data. And then also like data exfiltration, testing to see if data can be exfilled from the environment. And so if you're doing this type of testing, you want to make sure to use some fake data where you create it to look like credit card numbers or PII and try to exfil that. You don't want to exfil actual data, because then you cause an incident in the process. So web application pen testing. So OWASP is a really good resource out there. And one of the things nice about OWASP is they've got like an API top 10 now. They have like a top 10 and different resources for large learning models as AIs get more popular. But the more popular stuff you're going to see is the web security testing guide, as well as the OWASP top 10 and the OWASP API top 10. And another tip when it comes to web app pen testing is you want to go beyond the OWASP top 10, because the OWASP top 10 is the 10 most common vulnerabilities they're seeing. So it doesn't mean these other vulnerabilities have gone away. These are the most commonly seen and that are worth testing for. So different tools, so port and service scanners like Nmap, Masscan, Zmap are important scanners to use during these assessments. You're able to look for ports and services running on these systems. Vulnerability scanners are important too. Exploit tools like Metasploit, Core Impact, and Exploit Pack. And then command and control frameworks like Cobalt Strike. And so one of the nice things too with using some of these port scanners like Nmap, there's a vuln script, the NSE scripts that you run. There's one that basically works like a command line vulnerability scanner. So you're able to pick it up like open source vulnerability database, different CVEs for those vulnerabilities that you can collect information during that pen test. And it's kind of a way to validate maybe your Nessus scans, your Qualys scans. So vulnerability scanners, so you have your network vulnerability scanners. Tenable has several different vulnerability scanners, Nessus, Tenable Security Center. And if you're wanting to learn vulnerability scanners, then there's Nessus Essentials that you can download that test 16 IP addresses. And it's fully functional, just like Nessus Pro. So it's a good way to get experience, because you see a lot of these courses that they overlook the vulnerability scanner, and that's one of the tools that you're going to need to be able to use. And so other vulnerability scanners, Qualys, and Rapid7's Nexpose. Greenbone has their OpenVOS. They have a commercial and free version. And then Nuclei by Project Discovery. They've got a lot of really great tools, and Nuclei is a command line vulnerability scanner. And then your web application scanners like AppScan, Fortified DAST. And so we can open this up to questions. Here's my contact information. If you can't think of any questions while you're here, I'm happy to answer it later on. I'm constantly replying to people on my DMs on LinkedIn, but that's my contact information for anyone wanting to get into pen testing. If you check out my YouTube channel, I've got a whole playlist for my lectures that I did at Dallas College for my penetration testing course. And I've known some people that were studying for the Pen Test Plus that actually helped them in their studies. So that's a resource. And my podcast, you can find it at thephilipwylieshow.com. And it's on all popular podcast platforms and YouTube. So yes, could someone take a mic over to them? Yeah.
Which part of the process in the whole ranking of the pen test, when you went through the concepts all the way down to the report, which
Yes.
part do you learn from it?
So the
It's-
question was.
Yeah.
My question was,
Because they didn't hear you.
right, from, as you listed the process from, reconnaissance all the way down to reporting, which part of the process do you typically learn from the most?
Yeah, it just kind of depends on where you are in your process of learning. So like for me, what was probably the most difficult was a hard learning curve is the exploitation piece, actually hacking. But one of the things, the lessons to learn from reconnaissance is sometimes people don't do enough reconnaissance. And for anyone studying for the OSCP, you'll see one of the things they fail the test because they go through and they see something that looks like that is obviously the vulnerability, but they didn't do enough reconnaissance. So I think reconnaissance is the area that's not practiced enough. The area most people don't like is the report writing, but that's a very critical piece. And I really encourage you to learn that very well because communications is one of the best skills you can have. And when you're writing a pen test report, this is basically the end product that your customer or employer is getting is this pen test report. So make sure you thoroughly document the vulnerabilities, how they're exploited, take plenty of screenshots. Sometimes pen testers will just show the shell where they gain access to the system, not show the steps. So you really want to show the steps and even enough steps that someone as technical could go through, reproduce those steps to see if they were able to remediate that vulnerability. And so also with the executive summary, make sure you're able to explain things in a way that someone that is not a pen tester, someone that's not really technical can understand, because the board may be reading this pen test. It could be the CISO or some other management or business. So you want to make sure that they understand that. And when you're doing the pen test too, make sure with the different teams, let them know that you're on the same team. You're trying to help them. You're not trying to make them look bad. And on the pen test report, you want to state the things that they did a good job on. Maybe you're going through to test the place, but physical pen test is not in scope, but you're seeing some observations. You put that in a report. So that way it doesn't make them look totally bad. And you see some things that they're doing well. And sometimes that's a way to recommend some other assessments too, as well. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I did. Thank you.
Yeah, good question.
I'll take it off. A little shy guy. So what do you recommend for someone that has a background in full stack? I am personally just graduated university, so I'm familiar with networks, back end, building APIs. I always have been interested of learning security networks, like pen testing. So what do you recommend, like the roadmap? Because if you go online, you don't really see a practical roadmap. And if you get into books, they have a lot of information that will just keep adding more and more. It's like a learning loop.
So it looks like the point we're at, you've got the technology down, you really understand the area. So that's a good way to go into a good area to go into pen testing. So like network, cloud, that type of infrastructure type stuff is a good place. Because for me, I started out as a sysadmin before I got into security. So network pen testing was really easy for me to learn. So if anyone has like a development background or a software QA analyst background, that's gonna be easy for you to move into. So whatever you're doing, so if you've got that down, I would say if you do have any security areas, yours just mainly the building the infrastructure, maintaining and supporting infrastructure, or do you have?
I just have a learning knowledge on building full stack applications, back
Oh, okay.
end, like testing, but nothing specifically related to
Okay.
like networks.
So yeah, if you don't have the experience in networks, a free resource out there is Professor Messer has the Network Plus videos on his YouTube channel. So I'd recommend going there to learn. So that's really going to help you a lot with the skills you already have. But go to like that Network Plus content from Professor Messer and kind of learn that. You don't have to get the Network Plus, but just get through there and learn that. And then there's some good learning resources, have online labs like Try Hack Me and Hack the Box, and go through those resources.
And the pen testing cert is necessary too?
Yeah, there's some pen testing. So through that, once you kind of get the baseline of some security stuff in there, learn the networking, then like move on to Try Hack Me. TCM Academy has some really good courses that are really easy for people to use. Some of the things trying to jump right into like OSCP, you may need to study a little bit before you get into that. But yeah, TCM Academy, Try Hack Me and Hack the Box are really good areas to learn. And then coming to events like this, if you have any events that are really hands-on, a good one is if you go to DEF CON, there's a lot of hands-on villages there. Also like Wild West Hacking Fest, hosted by Black Hills Information Security Group. That's another good one. So it's really hands-on conferences. And for anyone trying to find the area of security, I would advise you to go check out different areas. You may find something, you may think you're interested in pen testing, but there may be something that you like even better.
Cool, thank you.
Good question.
So Phil, thank you for the talk. So we're a cybersecurity company to build a remote worker security. So one of the key features we have this end-to-end encryption and also quantum secure. So I have two questions for you. One of them is how do you do this pen test, this very advanced man-in-the-middle attack? That's one question. So second question is, if we want to start this pen test, what do you suggest? Where do we start?
So could you repeat those questions again?
Yeah, the first question is, how do you pen test the very advanced man-in-the-middle attack?
Okay.
Because it's end-to-end encrypted, quantum secure.
So like an instance where you've got remote workers and testing the end user, is that what?
Yeah, so how the customers using is they have the agent,
Yeah.
our Gopher app agent on their remote worker device, right? They also have the Gopher agent on their remote server environment. So we have this end-to-end encryption and plus that quantum secure.
Okay.
So we really want to pen test this man-in-the-middle attack, no matter how advanced it is. So what do you suggest? What do we do?
Yeah, so what you'd want to do there is take like an example environment. So one of the workstations or whatever, the setup like that, set up that situation and just see what, if you're on that same network, if you're able to attack that device, because you got end-to-end encryption, but you want to see if you're able to exploit that anyway. So testing the systems, even just getting on the system itself and testing the security configuration using something like CIS benchmark to just see if the system's hardened, and then from a network perspective, have that system on a network and then testing to see if you're able to intercept any of the traffic or hack into that system specific.
Second question is, if we want to start as a pen tester, what do you suggest? Where do we start?
Yeah, so starting as a pen tester, I would just kind of evaluate what your skill sets are and kind of look at the skills you need to do and do a gap analysis. So if you've got like an IT background, then you're going to need to learn some security. But say if you're already working in security, understand networking, then you're going to get into starting to take some of the pen testing courses. So like, as I mentioned before, whatever your background is, kind of start out in that type of pen testing. So if you're IT, you understand networking and servers and hosts, then infrastructure and network pen testing would be the place to start. Or if you're a developer, then application pen testing would be where to start. But once you gain that base knowledge, stuff like Try Hack Me, Hack the Box, and also TCM Academy is really good. TCM Academy is adding more stuff. Before they had just like a pen test, just a basic network pen testing course, but now they got web app and so all these different opportunities. Black Hills Information Security has their training called Anti-Siphon. And so they've got some pay what you can courses, and they even do like cloud pen testing, which is a little more hard to find cloud pen testing courses. But just do that. Just like I said, try Hack Me, Hack the Box, and TCM Academy. And with Hack the Box, they got their Hack the Box Academy, and they've got a lot of really good stuff out there. They got cloud pen testing, as well as they just keep adding different technologies that they test. They've got like web app pen testing certifications as well as network pen testing certifications.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, I'll just quickly comment because I ran into it with, I know you mentioned vulnerability scanners do a lot of false positives, and yes, I definitely have seen that, but I've also seen some false negatives.
Yes.
For example, a very popular one that you've kind of mentioned on some of your slides. I had an issue with it where they advertised how fast it was. Part of what it was doing is was scanning for things which were actually session cookies, and on a system where the PHP session token was configured to a different format. It just saw that, presumed the initial signature didn't match, never bothered to look for the application in the first place.
So yeah, that was you're just giving a comment. Was
Oh, just
your
a question? Well, just a comment. Just curious how common that is
Okay,
or not.
yeah. And it's really that you see the most false positives when it comes to web app pen testing or web apps application scanners.
I meant more in terms of false negatives.
Yeah, false negatives. Yeah, you find false negatives, but yeah, false positives. You find more of that. But that's one of the reasons too. You want to use different vulnerability scanners, because one of the things I did a pen test for a company once, they were using Nexpose internally, and with Nessus, I found something that they didn't find, but that could have very well gone the other way too. And we had some consultants when I was working for a bank that would test our pen test or test our ATMs, but they'd come in and run Nessus. They'd also run OpenVAS too to see if they could find anything. So that's one of the best ways to address the false negatives with network pen testing. And with web app pen testing, you can use a different scanner as well. So if you're using some sort of DAS, then you can use Burp Suite to also do a vulnerability scan against it too. But yeah, this is a great comment.
Funny thing is Nessus and OpenVAS are basically historically the same thing. But that's that's a whole other side thing. Is Nessus was originally open source, and when people started using it, they took it closed and other people forked it. That's how you got OpenVAS.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's interesting too. One of the things too that people may not do when they're doing network pen tests, sometimes not including the web checks with Nessus. Because when I used to work at a bank, and one of my colleagues was saying, "How are you finding all these vulnerabilities that I'm not?" They were just doing the basic network scan and not testing for any of the web services and stuff. Anyone else? And if you can't think of questions now, like I said, I'm always available on LinkedIn. You could reach out to me. Well, I guess that concludes the presentation. Thanks for attending the talk, and thanks for all the great questions.